Welcome back to the Victory Podcast. I'm your host, Steve McGrath. In this episode, I'm pleased to bring you my conversation with Rashad Butler. Now, today, you can find Rashad on 790 The Ticket, Miami area radio. But back in 2001, he was at the U. He was part of that Hurricanes football team that was one of the best ever. Spends most of his career with the Houston Texans after getting drafted in the third round in 2006. And he talks about his entire journey, including the ulcerative colitis that he was diagnosed with, which drastically shaped his NFL career. Now, before we get into that conversation, I have to remind you all that we are brought to you by Team Builder. And Team Builder works with over 500 high school football programs nationwide, as well as colleges in the NFL. So if you're looking for more information about how to shape your weightlifting routine, the structure, anything that goes into it, go to teambuilder.com, use the promo code VICTORY, and you're going to get a free gift. So show them some love. But now, here's my conversation with Rashad. All right, on the line, I am pleased to welcome none other than Rashad Butler. Rashad, thanks for taking the time today. How are you doing?
Doing great, man. No complaints at all. Saturday, got a chance to sleep in. Usually I work on Saturdays, but with everything going on in Miami, they gave me the day off. So I'm taking advantage of it because I do work again tomorrow. So I'm just trying to take advantage of this unusual day off for me.
Well, I'm sure you've earned it. And tomorrow is kind of a big deal in the NFL world. I mean, just this little game that they're going to play called the Super Bowl.
Yeah, the big game, because being in radio with promotions, you can't attach the word Super Bowl with any type of promotions because the NFL has that license and they can't sue you. So we have to say big game a lot when we're actually promoting the big game, if that makes any sense.
No, it makes complete sense.
Yeah.
The more I've done this, the more I understand you got to sort of tiptoe around some things that I was just completely oblivious to. So that being said, though, I mean, I'm sure you've been talking about it nonstop for the last 2 weeks. What's the gut feeling about how this game's going to go?
Oh, you know, see, last year I was the type of guy that I got lured to the Sean McVay offense, and that offense had things rolling, and I was under the impression that New England stood no chance with Brady just because this offense was just so dynamic and it was so powerful. And yeah, I got made a fool of really quick with that score being 13-3 and the Rams only scoring 3 points. So I think this year I learned my lesson from last year. And even though the Chiefs have a similar offense that the Rams had going last year, I'm going to go with defense, man. I still think at the end of the day, defense wins championships. So I'm going to pick the Niners. I really am.
Oh, I'm inclined to agree with you, but I think that the big difference between last year and this year would just be that it felt to me like Jared Goff really needed Sean McVay to sort of lay out a system and help him see the game better. Whereas
Uh-huh.
Patrick Mahomes is just such an unworldly talent that he, even if he gets confused by anything the Niners throw at him, there's always just that element of just unbelievable arm talent that he can throw the ball, 50, 60, 70 yards from any angle, any point, and you just never know. Can he bail his team out? So that's why I think there's going to be some fireworks tomorrow. I'm sure. You, of course, are located in Miami and you cover the Dolphins. So I also wanted to just talk a little bit about what is the state of the Dolphins been this past year? I heard tank for Tua at the beginning of the year, but what's the vibe now?
Well, it's funny how the narrative, I think, has changed a lot since the first part of the year, or I'll even go back to the off season. Working in sports radio and covering a lot of the Miami sports teams, one thing we heard a lot was tanking for Tua and so forth. But I think national media, for the most part, they created that narrative because after learning more about Brian Flores and who he is, I think we all got the sense that Brian Flores was going to come in and no matter what, he was going to try to win as many games as he could. Now, obviously, the Dolphins, as far as management, front office, Chris Greer and Stephen Ross, they depleted the roster because they wanted to start from scratch. But I think it was very commendable what Brian Flores, as a first-year head coach, was able to do with the talent of guys he had on that team and just with the revolving door he had at so many positions. I mean, he had a lot of undrafted guys starting. He had a lot of street free agent guys starting. I mean, the team was comprised of mostly undrafted street free agents. And then for him to go out there and be able to coach that team to 5 wins, no one saw that because I think with me, I remember on the radio, I said, and this was before the big trades they made with Larry Thompson and Kenny Stills. I said, this is a team I think a 4-12 team at best, and possibly a 3-13 team at worst. And then once those trades happened, I said, man, this is I think a 3-13 team at best, and probably a 2-14 team at worst. And for them to exceed those predictions, I mean, to win 5 games, and I mean, they had a chance to win, I think, at least 6 or 7 because they were in 2 other games that they could have won. I mean, again, it says a lot about the players as far as Ryan Fitzpatrick, Devontae Parker. I mean, he finally had the year that I think every Dolphin fan has been waiting for him to have. And it says a lot about Brian Flores for getting the most out of guys that a lot of people just thought were, guys that were just scabs in a way.
Oh yeah, I mean, in Minka Fitzpatrick leaving too. I
Yeah.
mean, there's just I'm not a Dolphin fan, but I would imagine that the average Dolphin fan was like, "Oh my, what is going on?"
Correct.
So to see that the way that they ended the season, to beat the Patriots the way they did, and that team showed so much fight. I mean, I'd imagine that everyone in Miami's probably feeling pretty good, and with the draft picks that they're going to have at hand, I mean, they have a chance to make a significant jump.
Yeah, I never grew up a Dolphin fan, but I can sense that this is probably one of the biggest off seasons in the franchise history because, like you say, you have a lot of draft capital. You have 3 picks in the first round. I think you have a total of 5 or 6 picks. I think 5 picks in the top. I think 50 of the draft, and then you have a boatload of money to spend in free agency. So the state of the franchise, I think, is really buzzing. And then now, this past week at media day, I think it may have been on Wednesday or Thursday, you had Tua, who was in town, who was giving a lot of interviews, and he made it well known that his family did, his father did, that they love Miami and they hope that Miami drafts him. So I think you have a kid like that who I think could have easily been the #1 draft pick if it wasn't for the hip injury, to show maximum or supreme interest in Miami as far as wanting to be drafted by that organization. I think it's a great state for the franchise. I mean, for the franchise to be in, because this has been a franchise and living in Miami for quite some time that has just been very mediocre. It really has.
Yeah, and I mean, ever since Marino's gone, right? I mean, Jay Fiedler did
Yep.
well. Shout out to our former podcast guest, Jay Fiedler.
Yep.
But since then,
Uh,
it's been really difficult to sort of fill that void. And I mean, is there any chatter about, well, Philip Rivers is leaving the Chargers? Tom Brady's going to be a free agent. Is there any sort of sense of like how the fans would react to throwing a boatload of money at one of these established players for a year or two to kind of bridge the gap while a Tua or a Herbert sort of comes in and gets up to
yeah.
speed?
Well, it's funny you bring up Brady because there has been reports now in the air that Brady loves Miami as far as the city, and him and Stephen Ross are close because Stephen Ross is a Michigan guy, and even now Brady is interested in potentially, when he's done playing football, buying some type of stock in the Miami Dolphins. And I think you have part of the fan base that wouldn't mind it, but I still think a good deal of the fan base has bought into the Dolphins are rebuilding. So I think that part of the fan base, the majority, thinks like, you know what, screw Brady. And again, I think I'm with them because if this was a few years ago, I wouldn't mind it. But I think the way everything went last year and the way I think this franchise is on the up and up with making the right moves that need to be made, and actually now going out in this year's draft with the first pick that they have at #5, and I think they'll probably have to trade up to #3 to get Tua. I just think it makes sense to just continue to uh, be on this trajectory that they are with Ryan Fitzpatrick, and then bringing in a guy like Tua to be the successor and to be the franchise quarterback. I just think that if you do bring in Brady, I just don't think that this Dolphins team right now is a Tom Brady away from either making the playoffs or being a Super Bowl contending team. One team I throw out there that I think is a Tom Brady away from making the Super Bowl, kind of like how Denver was a Peyton Manning away, is the Tennessee Titans. I know a lot of Dolphin fans may hate that because Dolphin fans still love Ryan Tannehill, and he had a great year this year. But I just think if you insert Tom Brady on that current team with all the pieces that they have in place, I think the Tennessee Titans can end up right back where they were this past season as far as in the AFC Championship and possibly getting over the hump. So I think if I'm Brady, if he is still concerned about trying to win Super Bowls, then I think that's the place to go. Now, if Tom Brady is more concerned about just, who he is and the market, then I think it makes no sense to either go to LA, the Chargers, or possibly the Las Vegas Raiders, because I think those are the two biggest markets that will be able to handle who Tom Brady and TB12 and that whole brand is.
Oh, absolutely. And just like how Miami has a big offseason, the Patriots have
Uh-huh.
one really big decision, and it's going to ultimately become a really big offseason, how they
Yeah,
play that and all the ripple effects from there. But
correct.
it seems like you're pretty all in on Tua. So, I mean,
Yeah,
so if you had your pick of anyone, any quarterback or any big free agent name that's sort of the one guy you think is best suited?
yeah. Here's my thing with Joe Burrow. I think Joe Burrow has had the best college football single season that maybe I've ever seen since Reggie Bush. And some may argue that his season as a whole was even better than Reggie Bush as far as just the numbers he put up and the position he played, which is quarterback position. But the one thing I love about Tua is just the entire body of work, going back to when he entered in that relief role in the 2017 or 2018 national championship, but it's a 2017 season.
Right.
Uh, and it's just I look at a guy who's had three different offensive coordinators and was able to have success under all three. And the thing about Joe Burrow, yes, he had a phenomenal season. I think throwing 44 touchdowns and 6 interceptions, like that's insane. But that's a guy that, his success I think was tied to Joe Brady as well. And now that Joe Brady is in the NFL, I think a lot of scouts are wondering, okay, how can Joe Burrow be successful without Joe Brady? And I think with Tua, we've seen success with so many different offensive coordinators, like so many, you know what I mean? To where I think he had Ryan Loxley early on, and then now he has Steve Sarkisian. So I think with Tua, and this is going to sound so cliche in a way, I think he's the safer pick. And it's crazy saying that when you have a guy that just had a serious hip injury. But I think if you're looking at the production side of it, he's a safer pick because he has more of a body of work than Joe Burrow.
I remember the last time the Dolphins got scared about a quarterback with an injury
Yeah,
history, and Drew Brees did pretty well afterwards. So it's one of those things where it's like you just never know.
yeah. Well, you know what? It's so funny about that because I think a lot of the media didn't really understand that Nick Saban wanted Drew Brees, and the organization wanted Culpepper. And one of the reasons why Nick Saban left, because he's like, listen, if I can't even pick out my groceries, I don't want to be here. And
Classic Parcells.
a lot of national people don't know that Nick Saban wanted Drew Brees. So Nick Saban, he had his eye on the right guy, but the organization was scared away by, the horrific injury that Drew Brees had the prior season in San Diego.
Fair enough. Well, thank you for indulging me in some Miami Dolphins talk. But I
Nope.
mean, Rashad, the reason why we got to
Yeah.
have this conversation is your journey to get to this point.
Okay. Sounds
And
good.
of course, you're in Miami now, but this is
Yeah.
also the area where you're playing high school football. So, do you mind walking us back, a good 20 years or so? Um, did you always want to play football? How did the road to Miami come about? Because I mean, if I have this right, you were a top offensive line recruit, particularly in
Yeah.
Florida. I mean, I'm sure you had a
Uh-huh.
couple of options there.
Yeah. So with me, see, the one thing I commend my parents for, my dad in specific, is he really put me in every sport imaginable. I think the first ever sport I played as far as organizational wise was t-ball, and then I moved on to baseball. And for the record, if my dad back then only informed me how much baseball players made compared to football players, I think I would have stuck with baseball. But you know what? Baseball was not my calling. I found that out very quickly because even though I was a great outfielder, I was horrible at hitting the ball. I mean, my hand-eye coordination was horrific. So baseball didn't work out that well, but I enjoyed it while I was playing it. Then moved on to basketball, and basketball was fun. I think basketball really helped establish my footwork as far as like my hand. I wouldn't say my hand-eye coordination, but my feet and eye coordination. But with basketball, I was just too rough. I was trying to contest everything, and I was always getting fouled out the game and things of that nature. And then, when I got of the age, my mom finally allowed my dad to put me in football. Because my mom was like, you know what, I don't want to put him in football until his pads are able to fit on him correctly. Because she was like, I don't want my son to be one of those kids running around with the helmet is all over the place and the shoulder pads are just up to here. She's like, no, like I want to make sure his equipment fits him perfectly and then he can play. But it's funny because I grew up in a neighborhood always playing football. Like we played two-hand touch in the street and tackle in the grass. And the bigger kids like myself, we were always running the grass because we knew we were hard to tackle. So once I played football, it just clicked. It just felt so natural. I mean, as far as me being rough, me being able to get dirty, tackle. And when I got to high school, it was somewhat of a shock because, when you're playing recreational football, organized football, at the ages of, I would say 10, 11, and 12, and I started at 12, you don't really understand about working out, lifting weights, and kind of going to practice and having a regiment in practice because, in recreation football, we call it, down here in South Florida, it's just, you have practice, but practice isn't really structured or organized the way it is in high school. But I adopted to it very well. And the moment I started taking football very, very seriously was the first letter I got. It was, I think, the end of my sophomore year because I played varsity my sophomore year. I started every game my sophomore year on varsity. And after that season, I got my first letter. And I can't remember what college it was from, but I know it was a very, very small college. But that's when it clicked in my mind that, okay, this can possibly happen. Because with one thing about me, I never really watched the NFL like that. I did because my dad loved it, but see, I was more of a college football guy because I knew for me that was like the next step up. So I pretty much became infatuated with college football at that age. And like I said, when I received that first letter, I was like, wow, this could really happen. Like I can actually see myself potentially playing on Saturdays in front of 80,000 plus people.
So, was it always offensive tackle? Did you ever try the defensive side of the ball when you got to high school?
It's funny. There was a time in high school where I played both sides, but I want to say my junior year, I went to a pretty big school. It was like 5A, and back then I think 6A was the biggest as far as population. So we had a lot of kids. So my junior year, I only played offensive tackle. And listen, I loved it because I hated playing both sides my sophomore year because I was just so winded, so winded.
All right. So, what's the process though for you to get to Miami? You said that you became infatuated with
Uh-huh.
college football. So, I mean, was it
Yeah,
just an obvious like I'm in West Palm, they're
yeah.
right there, or like how did the whole decision come together for you?
Well, it came together. So my dad grew up a Miami Hurricanes fan. So growing up, you know what? I liked Miami, but see, that was during the time where Miami was kind of coming off sanctions, so they really weren't that good. But again, my dad and I, we watched all of their games, even some of the games where they got blown out. I was more, and I hate to say this, I was more infatuated with Florida and Florida State because those were the Florida teams that were just, doing their thing at that time as far as the mid and late 90s. And I remember Florida and Steve Spurrier, he recruited me very, very hard because the high school I went to, uh, my head coach, he went to Florida. So there was a pipeline there. But I remember just telling Florida, like, you know what? I'm just not interested in going to Florida because that was during the time when Miami started to kind of turn things around as far as like 99, 2000. And Miami kind of became more of an infatuation for me. But it's funny, I say this. I was close to going to Alabama because the first school to really offer me was Alabama. And this was during the time when Alabama had guys like Sean Alexander, Andrew Zhao at quarterback, Freddie Miller at receiver. And they actually had a very, very, very solid team. But I just think I went to this one camp called Down and Dirty. It's a lineman camp. It took place in Lakeland, Florida, and it was for 3 days. And I went out there and I met Miami's offensive line coach at the time, Art Kehoe, and Miami's defensive line coach, Greg Mark, and they fell in love with me. And I remember it was the summer going into my senior year. I came back from that camp, and they offered me. And the minute they offered me, I seriously verbally committed. I'm like, listen, I'm going here. And uh, unlike the times now where kids have a verbal commit and kids can just, switch up at any time. Back then, the landscape was different. Like if you verbally committed back then, there was, I would say, a 95% chance that you were going to stay with that verbal commitment. Where I think now it's about a 50-50 chance that, you stay with that
Right.
verbal commitment.
So you got to tell me though, what's the first interaction with Larry Coker? How did that go?
Okay, so I remember Butch Davis and Pete Garcia, and Pete Garcia was like head of football operations. They came to my house sometime throughout, I think the off season. It was like the early off season, and there was a lot of rumblings about Butch potentially leaving and going to Cleveland. And I remember my parents and we all sat down, we had dinner, and we looked at Butch and we asked Butch about that Cleveland job. And Butch says, you know what? I have no intentions whatsoever, of taking that job. He's like, I came into Miami with a mission and I want to see that mission through. And he's like, when I came to Miami, we were in the dumps. And he's like, it's just a blessing to see, how hard the coaches have worked and how hard the players have worked to, bring Miami from out of where we once were. So I'm thinking, okay, I mean, this is going to be my coach. And I never forget, I was in school. I was actually coming out of lunch, not even a week later. And one of my friends, he comes up to me. He's like, are you still going to Miami? And I'm thinking like, wait, what do you mean? Like, of course. He's like, your coach just left. I'm thinking like, what, Butch Davis? I'm like, no. He's like, yeah. He's like, he's going to Cleveland. So my dad worked at the same high school I went to. I remember going to his office. I'm like, is this true? My dad's like, what? I'm like, Butch Davis is leaving. My dad's like, whoa. He's like, I didn't hear that. I'm like, yeah. I'm like, so-and-so just ran up to me and informed me that it's confirmed now. My dad's like, wow. He's like, well, if it's true, what are you going to do? And I looked at my dad and I said, well, if they keep someone in-house uh, and bring them on as head coach, I'll stay. But I'm like, if someone comes in that's not from that culture or in the house, I'm gonna leave. And my dad said, well, that sounds fine with me. And luckily that night, Larry Coker he reached out to me. He said, Rashad, it looks like they're gonna hire me as the next head coach. He's like, I don't want to jump to conclusions, but I have a good feeling that that's going to happen, and I just want to make sure that you're on board. And I said, listen, coach, you're a guy that is in-house. I said, even though I haven't had a lot of interaction with you, because he wasn't the guy that recruited me. The actual guy that was recruiting me was Greg Schiano at that time.
That's
Uh,
funny.
yeah. I'm like, but you are a guy that's in-house and you understand that culture and that environment. So I said, if you are hired as the head coach, you have my word that I will keep my verbal commitment and I will be a hurricane. And luckily, the news broke. I want to say the next day of Larry Coker getting the job, and yeah, that's how I went to Miami. And it's just funny because I just think, man, my class, and I like to brag about this. My class, I think, was probably the best class that ever came through Miami as far as freshman class. And I give all the credit to Butch Davis because he recruited us. It was myself, Frank Gore, Sean Taylor, rest in peace, Antro Roll, Kellen Winslow Jr. I mean, we had some studs, man. Roscoe Parrish, Rocky McIntosh. I mean, we had some studs in that class, man. Kelly Jennings, yeah. We were loaded, man. We were loaded back then.
Oh yeah, and I mean, you actually 2001, you redshirt your first year there, but I mean that '01 team. I mean, your class aside, just like the beast that had already been built, adding your
Yeah.
class to it. I mean, of course, you weren't actually like part of the team playing on the field, but I mean, you're there. You immediately start contributing the following year. But like, what's that ride like? Because you have all these expectations. The coaches
Yeah.
change, and then one of the best teams ever takes the field the following year.
To me, I was like a deer in headlights to best describe it because it was my first time in a college football, a big time college football atmosphere. And before this, I've seen it on TV, but seeing something on TV and being in it is completely different. And to me, I was at first, I want to say maybe a little overwhelmed because the guys are just so much bigger. I mean, to me, it was like, man, these are grown men. And I'm just like a kid. But eventually I was able to adapt to it. But one thing I learned from my true freshman year and being around guys like Ed Reed, Brian McKinney, Jeremy Shockey, Philip Buchanan, Mike Rump, the list can go on, Clinton Portis, is I learned great practice habits because one thing those guys did do on a daily basis, those guys competed, man. Those guys were not afraid to challenge one another and get after one another on a daily basis. And being in high school, I just never saw a group of guys or a team practice so hard and compete so hard and so well on a daily basis. And I understood, okay, this is why this university has risen, excuse me, from the ashes now to the top of the mountain because these guys really care about football first and foremost. And these guys are not afraid to challenge one another and compete. And that's one thing I learned, man. And then, it was I think we were able to keep that up for quite some time after that 2001 year, with going back to the national championship in 2002 and unfortunately being cheated out of that game. But man, I mean, I just have so many good times from the University of Miami because I mean, it was a roller coaster of a ride. And I tell people that first year to get a sense of how the city of Miami really embraced us. We were like rock stars. I remember being 18 years old, and I was getting treated like I was an NFL player because at that time the Dolphins really weren't that good. The Heat really weren't that good. I mean, we were the main attraction. Everybody in Miami loved the University of Miami football team, and again, it was just something that I'm like, wow, like I went from a kid growing up in West Palm Beach, Florida, which is quite quiet, to now in the epicenter of college football. Because at that time, I hear, sometimes Lindell White, Matt Leinart, they talk about, Los Angeles in 2004 and 2005 was the epicenter of college football because USC was so dominant. But I tell people, imagine that. But now let's rewind back to at least 2001, 2002, where Miami was the epicenter of college football. And Miami is already a crazy place like Hollywood is. So, I mean, you can imagine a group of, guys that are 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, just being at the epicenter of college football and in a place like Miami, which is just already so crazy.
Oh yeah, I can only imagine, and I'm
Yeah.
sure that there's plenty of stories that you have that are
Oh, yeah.
not meant for the public. And I mean, I could go down the Miami rabbit hole all day, but in respect for your time, if I can hit the fast forward button just a little bit,
No problem.
we know that in 2004 you get a chance to start, and I believe it's because Eric Winston goes
Yeah.
down. 2005, your senior year, you're now a starter. So you've gone from this redshirt guy that's deer in the headlights, as you say, to
Yeah.
you're a legit starter on a powerhouse team, and you work your way into getting into the NFL. At what point did you realize that was a legitimate option for you, that you were not just going to like, maybe I'll make it to by the end of your senior year? It's like, oh yeah, you're getting drafted. You're going to be a pretty good
Well,
pick.
to correct you, my redshirt sophomore year was when I started in place of
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So my redshirt because I stayed all 5 years. So my redshirt junior year was 2004. That was my first year as a complete starter for the entire season. And in 2005 was my second year, my last year as a full time starter. And I think at the beginning of my redshirt senior year, my last year, because I started to hear a lot of buzz that was being, I guess, given to myself and well, I would say Eric Winston and I. And I think that's when it became a reality. But I just wanted to really focus on having the best last season I could have. And I remember maybe halfway through that season was when the buzz started to pick up more. And that's when I knew, okay, I can really get drafted because people are talking about me now potentially getting drafted, either in rounds either in round 4 or round 5, because back then that was when the draft was Saturday and Sunday. As far as the first 3 rounds were Saturday, and the last 4 rounds were on Sunday. And again, I remember after that season, that's when everything started to pick up. Luckily, I got invited to the East-West Shrine game. I played in that game with guys like Marcus Colston. Who else? Greg Jennings played in that game. I'm trying to think of any other notable guys that played in that game, man. But it was some guys that had some illustrious careers. Andrew Whitworth, he played in that game. And I remember coming back from that game, and my agent at the time, who I had, he was calling me. He's like, "Listen, I don't know what you did at that game, but the buzz is starting to pick up now to where a lot of scouts and personnel people are talking about, you could easily be a first day guy, as far as talking about possibly squeezing in round 3." And I'm like, wow, that's crazy, because when I first hired my agents, the buzz was a guy that was going to be at the earliest 4th round, at the latest 5th round. So I kind of got my mindset on that, because I don't like disappointments. And yeah, when I came back from that East-West Shrine game, that's when, I think everything picked up, and I went to the combine. And I didn't really do much of the combine because I wanted to wait to the pro day. And after pro day, that's when I think things were starting to solidify themselves a lot more. And then I remember draft day, sitting around. And again, I watched the draft because I'm a fan of football, and that was a year where Mario Williams was taken number 1 overall, and then you had Reggie Bush, and you had guys like Vince Young, Matt Leinart, and so forth. And I'll never forget it. I remember. Sorry about that. Hold on. I remember driving to Wendy's with my dad later that night, and I get a phone call from a 704 number. I had no idea what a 704 number was. I'm like, man, what is 704? And I pick up the phone, and there's this guy. He's like, Rashad? I'm like, yes. He's like, this is so-and-so from the Carolina Panthers. I'm like, okay, what's going on? He's like, well, we're going to select you with our next pick, 89th overall. We're just calling to just talk with you, and how would you like to be a Carolina Panther? I'm like, man, I would love it. And yeah, that's how my draft day experience went down. I was actually driving the Wendy's with my dad, and that's when I got the phone call.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Now, your time with the Panthers is just, from an outsider's perspective anyway, just kind of crazy. I mean, it
Yeah.
seems like they kind of like knew that you were a little undersized. Yeah, I mean, you had the hype, but weight-wise, you were just a little smaller than the prototypical
Yeah.
tackle. And can you just talk us through what your experience was physically trying to get yourself ready to play in the NFL?
Okay, so at Miami, we were a team that ran a lot of wide zones, so we did a lot of running. So coming out of college, I was about maybe 285, and I knew going into that off season, as far as training for the combine, I needed to gain at least like 10 to 15 pounds, and it was tough. And I remember weighing in at the combine at 292. So when I got to Carolina, I was about maybe 290 or so. And again, they wanted me to put on more weight. But the thing about Carolina, I just think that it was my first time really being by myself and on my own. And you hear the cliche of when you're in college, you're broke, and you're just you're trying to do whatever to get by. But it's funny because in college you don't really mind because everyone's doing that you're playing with. And I was drafted 3rd round, so I got a pretty hefty signing bonus. Not as much as these kids are getting nowadays, but it was pretty hefty at the time. And man, I mean, football was the last thing on my mind. I mean, I was just in a new city, just trying to adapt, just trying to have fun. And football should have been primary, and for me, it was secondary. And my rookie season was just up and down because I only dressed the first 2 games, and then after that, I didn't dress again. And then I caught staph infection in my right leg. I think in week 13 or 14, that kind of put me on IR for the rest of the season. And then I remember coming back that offseason hungry because I knew that this was the time I had to make that jump. And I remember getting struck with uh, ulcerative colitis. So I've been having ulcerative colitis now since 2017, and since 2007, excuse me. And before then, I never had any symptoms. So that offseason was very strange because I had symptoms as far as I was using the bathroom a lot. I had a lot of bowel movements, had a lot of bloody stools, and I was just losing so much weight, and I was just so tired, and I didn't know what was going on. And I went to the training staff uh, in Carolina, and they didn't know what was going on either. And I went to doctors after doctors, and they couldn't figure it out. And I think, you know, it's so amazing that I went through an entire offseason in training camp battling that, to where there were days where I was just tired just walking down a hallway for about maybe not even a minute, but I found a way to make it through training camp. It's crazy. And I think Carolina just kind of felt a sense of betrayal, because I think for them, when they were doing, my background checks from the combine, like, this didn't come up. And so I think they thought that this was something I was hiding, and I didn't. So after training camp, and I felt I had a good training camp, they released me, and that was surprising because, again, I just felt that the training camp I had was very promising, and I think from my aspect, I really dedicated myself to football that off season. And when I got cut, yeah, it was very, very surprising. But I think it was a blessing in disguise, because I was on the waiver wire, not even for maybe 2 or 3 hours. And Houston called, and the GM at the time, Rick Smith, a guy I'm very fortunate of, and the head coach at the time, Gary Kubiak, a guy I still love to this day. They took a chance on me, and Rick Smith, he knew exactly what I was suffering from. And when he brought me in, he got me to a gastro right away, and they were able to diagnose what I had and got my condition under control. And I've been in remission, ever since. And that's when things really start to take off for my career in Houston.
And that's wild, right? That
Yeah,
you have to wrap your head around, like, I don't know what's wrong with me, but you're pushing through it. The fact that
yeah,
you get cut in one day, right?
yeah,
I have a great training camp. I like where, my life and my career is going in Carolina,
yeah.
to, I don't have a job, to, okay, I'm heading to Houston. I mean, as a young man, how do you just take all that in and just sort of try to, like, be a professional while your entire world is getting sort of tossed all over the place?
I think when you're young and when you're in the NFL, you do a good, you you do a better job of really handling things, because you're still like a deer in headlights, because I watch how a lot of uh, veteran players may handle things like that. And it's a lot tougher for them because they know the ins and the outs, and they understand why and how these decisions are made. But when you're young, you don't really understand that yet. So you kind of, in a way, go with the flow. So when that happened, I was going with the flow. And even, my first, I would say, year in Houston, I was going with the flow. But it was great because Houston gave me a chance to put back on the weight. They gave me a chance to learn the system, and they never put any pressure on me to really come in and play right away. I think I put pressure on myself to really come in and learn the playbook as fast as I could have, and I think I put even more pressure on myself to really get myself back to great condition. But I mean, the time I spent in Houston, man, was great. I mean, I would have never imagined that I would be in Houston for 6 seasons. I mean, I spent from 2007 all the way until 2012 in Houston.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, obviously the bulk of your career. So when you look back, I just want to ask about the team itself. Of course, you're playing with fellow guys from the U
Yeah.
and
Uh-huh.
Andre and then Chris Myers, as we talked about. But on that defense, and of course, some of these guys changing out there for your entire tenure. But I mean, when you get there, it's Demeco Ryans, Brian Cushing. That number one pick, Mario Williams, is there.
Uh-huh.
Moby Okoye comes in, and but just when it comes to those guys, a talented defensive front seven. You get Eric Winston again. It seems like you were tied to him most of your career, and other guys from the U. What was it about that group of guys? And if you could just talk also a little bit more about Coach Kubiak, what are some of the lasting memories and why you guys were able to have the level of success that you were?
So one thing that was different in Houston from Carolina, when I went to Carolina, Carolina was a very veteran team. I think the majority of the team was comprised of guys that were either 5 years and up. I went into a very, very older locker room. And I got that sense. And that was fine. I think I needed that as a rookie, to be around guys that have been doing it at a high level for quite some time. Like, again, I was in the locker room with guys like Jake Delhomme, who was a guy I think at the time may have been, I think, on his 10th year, maybe even more. A guy like Steve Smith, who I think at the time was in his 6th year. A guy in Julius Peppers, who at the time I think was like in his, I think, 5th or 6th year. A guy, I remember Michael Rucker, he was, I think, in his 12th year. Mike Mentor, another guy who I think was like in his, I think, 12th year as well, or maybe a little older. Keyshawn Johnson, of course, that was like his last year playing football. So I was in a very, very veteran locker room. So when I went to Houston, it was the total opposite. I think we may have had about 5 guys that were guys that had 8 years or more, and everyone else was like, 5 years or less. So it was a very young locker room, but I love that because it gave us a chance to grow together. And I think Kubiak liked it as well too, because Kubiak was a first-time head coach. He was a young guy, a player's coach at that, because he was a player himself, a backup quarterback. And I think he did a good job of really working with us, as far as he knew when to show us tough love, but he knew when to give us that fatherly advice, as far as like, listen, we're a young team, but we have to grow up. And, we had our growing pains. I would say 2007 and 2008, we went 8-8 both seasons, what I mean? And we saw incremental progression, but not the progression we wanted. But, over the course of my 6 years being there, we just got better and better. And, we acquired guys like, Brian Cushing, who came in 2009, a guy like J.J. Watt, who came in 2011, guys like that who just kind of walked in from day one and understood what we were trying to build. And, we were able to, I think do a good job of bettering that franchise. I think my only thing I'm a little, I wouldn't say sad or upset about. I just wish that Rick Smith, our GM at the time, did a better job of keeping us together as far as that core nucleus. Because, our best 2 seasons, were 2011 and 2012. And I forgot about, an important guy that played into that success, Arian Foster. He was a guy that came in as an undrafted free agent in 2009 it was. And I just think after 2012 season, when we had, I think, our best season in franchise history, he split a lot of guys up because, for one, he didn't want to pay Mario Williams the money that the market demanded at that time. And that's when Mario went to Buffalo. He traded D'Amico Ryans and so forth. I just think a lot of our core nucleus players, we just left. I know Eric Winston, I think the year before he left, they let him walk. Or I think they released him. I can't remember. He was in Kansas City. So a lot of the guys that were there since day one in 2007 were no longer there. And I felt like if you would have done a better job of maybe keeping that core group of guys together for maybe 1 or 2 more years, then I think we potentially could have had a chance to reach the AFC Championship, or if not the Super Bowl.
Yeah. It's felt like for a decade now, the Texans have always kind of been right there. They just feel like they're always a piece or two away from being able to be that legit, top 4, top 5 team. But I wanted to ask you, since obviously you're spending time now and doing a great job working in radio, have you gained perspective on, because it seems like you're sort of alluding to this, you've gained perspective on how you look at the game and sort of what's being played at the higher level with the GMs, the coaches, the owners. When you look at, now that you can sort of take a step back and look objectively on what happens, do you sort of look back and be like, oh, maybe I handled something, wrong? Or, do you just now have the perspective to look back on your career and understand some of the things that were happening at the time that maybe didn't make sense?
Yeah, because I understand now why Rick Smith did what he did with Mario, because when you're a GM, you always have to have the team's best interests in mind. And, the market value for Mario was very high. And, I think that's commendable for Mario, because Mario created that value for himself. So I get why, he let Mario walk, because that was just the money that Buffalo gave him was just astronomical at the time for an edge rush player that Mario was. And then I understand the trade with D'Amico, because there was good value that came back in that trade, as far as I think we acquired, I think, if not another player, but I think a player in a draft pick. I can't remember exactly. So I don't want the listeners to kind of quote me on that. But I understand it now. But still, a part of me, I'm very competitive. And I just felt that if we at least would have had maybe 1 or 2 more years together,
Sure.
it possibly ended up really good for the organization.
Yeah. Oh, completely understood.
Yeah.
But I do want to ask about 2013, your last year
Okay.
playing in the league.
Yeah.
You play a number of games with the Browns. So could you walk us through just what that year was like? Because you're obviously with the Browns, you're at a new
Yeah.
franchise, and then you have a short stay in Pittsburgh. Can you just
Yeah.
walk us through what was going through your head and what you were doing that year?
Yeah. So my last 2 years in Houston were very, very trying. I would say my first 4 years were great. But my last 2 years, I suffered 2 season-ending injuries. So take you back to 2011. During that season, I was in competition to be the starter with the guy that I'm still good friends with, in Derek Newton, and we were battling, and we had a great battle, and he actually beat me out, and I was very commendable towards him about that battle. But Kubiak made it known that, listen, we still are going to rotate you both throughout the course of every game we play, because the competition was still so neck and neck. And I tore my right tricep tendon in practice week 3 in one-on-ones, and that sidelined me for the remainder of that season. Well, no, you know what? Actually, no. I apologize. My memory's a little bad. Actually, that season I was backup to Eric Winston. I was a swing tackle that season. And yeah, when I tore my tricep, I was devastated, because I just felt like, when you go through any NFL season, there's a potential for any starters up front to get hurt. And I just felt like, listen, I wasn't wishing either Dwayne Brown or Eric Winston to get hurt. But again, it's a possibility, because, offensive line is very physical, and we play 16 games. And so when I got injured, I was like, man, my chance of potentially starting somewhere down the line, I mean, it's over now. So I worked that entire offseason to get back. And that was a tough injury, because that took me 9 months to actually get back to full and complete strength. And going into, I would say, that season, so that offseason is when they let Eric Winston walk, where I think they released him, and he got picked up by the Chiefs. And now it was up to me and Derek Newton to compete for the starting position at right tackle. And again, we were competing. And I remember before the last preseason game, they named the starter as Derek Newton. And again, like I said, I was commendable to him about that. And the plan was for me to play, I think, 2 series in the final preseason game. And on the last series that I was in, I actually tore my left tricep tendon. And I was because Kubiak had told me after he named Newton the starter that, listen, he's like, I'm still going to be subbing you in, here and there, because it's not solidified, because the battle was so close. And for that to happen again, I just knew my season was over with. And I signed a 2-year deal with Houston after the lockout in 2011. So that was my final year. And that's why I pushed so hard in 2012, because I knew that was the year where, okay, I can create a pretty good market value for myself on the market if I have a great 2012 season. And yeah, man, when that happened, I was just devastated. So it took me some time to kind of pick myself up, because when you have a injury like that happens in consecutive years, it's devastating. But I did. And I remember the 2013 off season. It was very weird, because Detroit flew me out, Cleveland flew me out, and it kind of seemed like either of those teams really weren't interested. But Cleveland actually, they gave my agent a call back, and they wanted to bring me in for the entire off season, as far as all season workouts, mini camp, OTAs, and training camp. And I think Cleveland was under the impression they kind of had me like as a camp body, but I did my thing and I excelled. So I made the team after training camp, and yeah, man, I mean, I was just doing my thing, and they released me, and that was so unexpected because that was during the time where I think you could designate, I think, 2 players to return from IR, and we had a guard that got hurt early in the preseason. I think he had a very, very significant high ankle sprain, and when they wanted to bring him back, they had to let somebody else go on the offensive line. And I guess since they looked at me as the swing tackle and not really having a lot of value, they decided to let me go, and they released me, I want to say, early November 2013. And I'm not gonna lie, I was devastated because I didn't see that coming, because I was doing my thing. I was a swing tackle, backing up both Joe Thomas, legend, I think, and Mitchell Schwartz, who's doing this thing for the Chiefs now. And those are 2 great guys. You know, I spent a lot of time with them, talked a lot of football with them, and I think it caught everyone by surprise when, I was no longer, on that team. And Pittsburgh gave me a call, and Pittsburgh didn't bring me in for a workout. Pittsburgh wanted to sign me right away, and I signed with them. But I was at the stage of my career where I wanted another opportunity to start, and I don't think Pittsburgh was offering me that chance. So I just said, you know what, man, this may be the end of the road, because I never was a guy that just wanted to be on the team and just be like a career backup. I wanted to play because I experienced that feeling in Houston, because when Dwayne Brown had his suspension in 2010, I started 4 games for him, and I did, and again, I did really well. So, once you get that taste of starting, it's very hard to go back to a reserve role. It really is.
Oh yeah, understood. And at least in the Cleveland Browns defense, the Cleveland Browns are going to Cleveland Brown themselves into not winning much of anything, particularly
Yeah.
in that time frame. So I mean, what can you expect there?
Yeah.
But that from what I can see anyway, the Pittsburgh Steelers, when you're there, that's sort of the last that you're associated with an NFL team. So can you just talk about that decision to not pursue it any further? Like, how did you eventually come to that? And
Well, it was tough. So I woke up the morning when I was going to, I guess, meet the team for the first time, and I just woke up like, yo, I don't want to do this no more. Like, I don't want to, play this game and just be a career back or just be collecting a paycheck. I'm like, that's not who I am. So I remember calling my agent. I was emotional, and I expressed how I felt at the time, and he was trying to do what any agent would do. Like, listen, I understand, but just give it a try. I'm like, I can't, man. And I remember calling my my mom and my dad and talking with them, and like supportive parents they've always been my entire life. They say, listen, it's your decision, it's your life. And when it first happened, I had some regret and a lot of remorse about it, but again, when I look back on it, I've always been the type of guy that, I wanted to be a part of the team, as far as I wanted to be able to contribute. And if I felt that at any time I wasn't going to do that, especially later in my career, I never wanted to be a guy that was just collecting a paycheck and happy with doing that. So that's why I just decided, you know what, this may be the end, and I'm fine with that, because at least now I know that I'm sticking to who I am as a person, as far as a guy that's just not going to be on a team collecting a check and not playing.
yeah, and that's awesome. But
Yeah.
for you to make that big call, you now have to kind of come to grips with like, well, I'm no longer an NFL player. So, you seem like you had a very good foundation. You knew who you were. You weren't pinning necessarily your identity to being an NFL player, but still to understand that, okay, there's this new chapter I'm going to start. Of course, we know today you're in sports radio, but how do you ultimately navigate that space?
It's tough. The one thing that helped me out, uh, I stayed busy. And that's one thing I try to encourage a lot of players to do once they leave the game, is don't take that year to just sit around, because idle time is very dangerous on the mind. So one thing I did, I got involved in a business with a buddy of mine at the time, and I just did everything I could with him just to kind of stay busy and to keep my mind off of, football, what I was so used to the past, 8 seasons and so forth. And I think that really helped me out as far as not only keeping me or keeping my mind occupied, but it really made me just forget about what had transpired over the past year or so.
Got it. Well, we know ultimately that you end up where you should be talking about sports, something that you're very good at. So I'm sorry I didn't ask this at the top. What radio station is it? Where can people listen to you?
Okay, so I work for Intercom Miami. We are under the Intercom umbrella, and I work for both 560 WQAM and 790 AM in Miami. They're two local sports radio stations. We used to be enemies, but now we're partners now because we merged under the Intercom umbrella, and I've been with them now since 2017. My first full year with them was 2018.
No different than playing against a rival in college and you both get drafted by the same team the following year. Sometimes it just
Yeah,
happens that way.
yeah, it does.
Well, Rashad, I'm about to ask you to put down that helmet one more time because we're going to head into the gauntlet to wrap up our podcast here. So I have to know, what's your knee-jerk answer? What's most important? Is it having the number one offense or the number one defense?
Defense.
Had a feeling we were going to go that way. Now,
Yeah.
did you have a pregame ritual that you stuck to?
Ooh, man. So my pregame ritual was I used to always look at the media guys that we used to get in our lockers before the games. And I used to love just like going through there and just making fun of people's mug shots as far as my teammates and, players on the opposing team. I used to listen. I did that every Sunday, every time I played. Like I had to look at the mug shots of my teammates and, like I said, the players of the opposing team.
That's great.
Yeah.
Now, was there ever one player or one coach that you just wish you would have had the chance to line up with or play for?
Gary Kubiak, man. I love Kubiak because, I played for 3 head coaches, and the other coaches I love too, as far as John Fox with the Carolina Panthers and Rob Chudzinski, who was my offensive coordinator at Miami. I think for one of my many years at Miami. But one thing about Gary Kubiak, he did a really good job of understanding that we were men first and foremost. And I never forget, every year in training camp, he would have a meeting to where he would talk about, life after football. And he used to always say, man, there's only about 10% of guys in this room who are going to be able to make it to that second big contract or 3 contracts and so forth. And they're going to have money to where they don't need to have another job when they're done with football. And kudos to those guys, whoever those guys may end up to be. But he's like, there's still 90% of guys that are going to not be able to make, that amount of money. And they may not make it to that second contract. And that group of guys, that group of guys are going to have to find a way to live for the rest of their life. And he said, men, the relationships you make in the NFL, whether it's around this building or whether it's outside this building, be respectable and understand that, the people you may come across may be people that can help you out later in your life. And after hearing that, I want to say for 6 seasons, it really started to hit home for me. I think after the 3rd time I heard of that, like, it's true. Not everyone that plays the game is going to be able to make that money to where they can potentially wake up at 12 noon every day and, not have to worry about, their bank account moving that much. But there's still like a great deal of guys that are going to have to, wake up and find some line of work that they love and, and make a living for themselves. And, that may sound so cliche. And I think a lot of listeners may think like a lot of coaches have that talk, but again, I've been in 3 locker rooms, and that was the only locker room where that talk happened once a year in training camp. And I admire Kubiak so much for having that talk because, a lot of the coaches don't really think of the players as players, but he thought of us, as players and as men first, which was, it really was important to me.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's why he's probably so revered by so many former and current
Yeah.
players. Well, what's most important? Is it the players or is it the scheme?
Uh, uh, man, that's a really good question, man. I get into this argument a lot on the radio with a lot of fans. I do the post game for University of Miami, and this past season things were bad. And a lot of, I guess, listeners want to blame everything on coaches and schemes, but I think it's I think it's 50-50, man. I really do, and I know that may not be the answer you want to hear because I'm playing the fence, but I just think that you know coaches play a huge part in the success of players, in player development. But at the end of the day, players have to attain that information and they have to go out and execute. And if they don't execute, then the team is not the team is not successful, and uh, the lack of success then reflects back on the coaching staff. So I think it's tied at the hip. You know, I still think, I guess to answer your question, I think players matter just a little bit more, but I just still think the margin is still so close because I really believe that both go hand in hand. They really do.
Of course, and obviously there's no right answer to the
Yeah,
question, but
correct.
thank you for leaning just a little bit one way.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. So lastly, and I think it's the most important question, just considering everything that you've been through,
Uh-huh.
what is the best piece of advice that you would give right now to a young 16, 17-year-old kid?
Uh, Whatever you choose to do in life, man, just put your head down and do it. Don't really think too much about it at this time because you're young, and enjoy growing up with, no major responsibilities. But at the same time, I have this saying as far as don't leave any water in that wash rag, to where whenever it's time to wring out that wash rag, make sure that there's no more water that is dripping down from that wash rag. Like, get everything out of whatever it is you're doing, man, because you know, I've had the experience to live with regret for, I would say, maybe a couple of years now, and it's not a good feeling. And I just advise, young kids that you don't want to have that feeling at a young age of, oh, I should have done this, and vice versa. So I guess my advice would be to, like I said, squeeze every drop of water out of that wash rag, so you know that whenever uh, that day comes for you, whether it's, after high school, because again, not every kid's going to be fortunate enough to play college football, or if it comes after college football, because we know not every kid is fortunate enough to play in the NFL, or if, you play in the NFL for a year or two, just make sure that, whatever it is, at what level, you stop at, that when you stop, you have no more to give, to whatever it is you're doing.
Awesome. Great
Yeah.
words of wisdom right there. Well, Rashad, can't thank you enough for taking the time today. Thank you so much
Problem.
for coming on.
Thank you.